I would want to reflect with us briefly on a theme I'm calling Hearts of Protest, Hearts for Protest. Yeah? After all, that's all that's been unfolding. Yeah? But what is a heart? What is a heart for protest look like? I want to begin with this question. Is there a place for protest in the Christian movement? Is there a place for protest in the Christian movement? Is there? Absolutely, there is. If you are there, I am not condemning you. I'm applauding you, right? You are doing a Christian duty as well. And this is why, as long as human beings have been alive and have organized themselves in societies and nations, tragically, there often occurs some occasions of injustice and oppression. Oftentimes, injustice and oppression tends to have a free run until someone calls it out or the oppressors run out of authority. And because of that, you just find once in a while people stand up and say no or call out the injustice, and it's a very godly thing. If you look even at the scriptures, especially in the Old Testament, the prophets were known for this. Most of the prophetic writings are someone stirred up by God, speaking truth to power, calling a nation to repentance, because they are diverting from the right way. So there's a place for protest. It doesn't mean it only occurs in one way. Maybe you go to the street, but there's a place for calling out injustice and responding. And so because of this, Jesus did have a few thoughts and comments about this, and I want to pick one of them today and see what we can learn together. And so I'm going to invite you to Matthew 5, 38 to 48. Matthew 5, 38 to 48. Matthew 5, 38 to 48. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evildoer. But if someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your coat, give your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go also the 2nd mile. Give to everyone who begs from you, and do not refuse anyone who wants to borrow from you. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain to the righteous and on the unrighteous. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers and sisters, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. And that's the word of the Lord for us this morning. Thanks be to God. What a passage, right? What a passage. This is one of those passages I have to admit I have struggled with for the longest time. I had even given up on understanding it. I used to read and say, one day it will make sense, right? One day it will make sense. Because is Jesus really serious? Is he? Does he know how the world works? Has Jesus ever been bullied? Did he turn the other cheek? Those kind of questions arise for me. I'll never forget one day. I don't know if you've ever been slapped in public. Have you? Or okay, I believe anyone at any point has received a slap, maybe in private. I don't know. Yeah? I don't know if you've ever been slapped. I remember a couple of slaps. I've been a victim of a couple of slaps. One day I remember my headmaster, I was in a boarding school in primary school, finding me asleep. And I didn't even notice he was there until he woke me up and slapped me. And I used to read those comics and see someone has been slapped and they see stars. I literally, we were in class, I literally saw stars. Yeah, but the one that stands out is, once again, we moved from boarding school, went to our day school, and we were walking home. And as always, every market has a madman, right? And so that particular morning, unfortunately, we used to meet him. He used to have problem with no one, but that day, he just slapped me. Right, he just slapped me on my way to school, and I stood there confused. Adrenaline kicked in. I ran for my life, but I carry that slap today. I'm like, why did he do that? He's my friend. I used to give him a coin. I don't know. Anyway, it's madness. Yeah. So, if you've ever been slapped, think about that and think about these words of Jesus, and maybe you'll wonder, Jesus, what are you getting at? So let's provide a little bit of context. During Jesus' time, Israel was occupied and ruled by Romans. They were not kind to the Jews. They imposed heavy taxes on them, and in addition, they installed corrupt tax collectors who often would have people overtaxed. Sound familiar? Do you know a country that goes through? Anyway. In addition to taxation, they were ruled. They ruled them. It was military rule. The Romans would conquer you and say, we are your conquerors. And they had this philosophy they would call Pax Romana, which means Roman kind of peace, which meant literally they squash any military revolt or resistance or insurgency. They called it peace. Things were stable, but there was no opposition, and they did what they could. There was no policing. It wasn't invented. So it was the military, the soldiers. And because of that, the Roman soldiers moved around doing what they thought was right. There was no justice. If they thought you were on the wrong, based on how he was feeling that day, he would implement his justice right there and then. So these examples that Jesus is quoting, if someone slaps you, turn the other cheek. If someone sues you for your coat, give him your undergarment as well. And if someone asks you to carry a luggage for a mile, go for two. Those were not random examples. They were not abstract. They were not arbitrary. They were common occurrences. In fact, I wonder if Jesus had ever been a recipient of the slap, because it was a common thing, right? I wonder if Jesus had been forcefully asked to carry, military hardware for a mile. And he must have observed it happening countless times. And as he addresses these injustices, perhaps he shares something. They may be very contextual there and then. The people who had Jesus that day, they knew exactly what he was talking about. They had been recipients of that oppression. But maybe for us, we can learn a thing or two because of our moment here and going forward. So Jesus says, but if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. Turn the other also. Everything there is deliberate. Right cheek, Someone slaps you on the right cheek. So you can imagine people facing each other. Yeah? If you're facing me, because you're all facing me, your right cheek is on the opposite that side, right? So normally it would be easier if I'm hitting your right cheek to use my left hand so that it can land properly. I never thought in my entire life of ministry we are going to be talking about the technicalities of a slap, right? Have you ever seen those videos of slapping competitions? Yeah? Power slap, yes. Yeah? So it would be ideally that, but this was a very standardized culture. Most people were right-handed by then. So the Romans had this mockery kind of thing that they used to do. They treated the Jews as inferior to them, and they did not even consider an inferior Jew deserving of a proper slap. With a fist. And so they would use their backhand. So they would use their right hand to hit the right side. And so they would use their backhand. And it's almost like spitting on someone else's faces. So when they would do a slap to the right side of the face, they would be saying you're an inferior inferior person, you're worthless, and you're useless. So this is what Jesus is saying. If someone slaps you on the right, bah, okay? So obviously you will turn that way to the left. Then turn, turn the left cheek as well. And if he has to hit the left cheek, he will be forced to give you a proper slap for a peer, right? There. Joey, can we demonstrate a bit? Let me borrow you. Today I'm going to take it the full length. I'm not going to slap you. But never, I was thinking of WWE. Yes, you can come, right? So that you can see it. And power slap competition, we're just going to do what they do in WWE, yeah? Right? So because I'm a Roman soldier, yes, and Joe is the Jew. And as a Roman soldier, this guy is useless and worthless, and I want to stamp my power to him. I'm not going to give him a proper slap. That one is reserved for when I fight my fellow Romans, who are, these guys are inferior. There was a lot of classism. So I'm going to slap him like that, yeah? And it's going to be like that, yeah? And so you can imagine what he's feeling at that point. It's okay, you can relax. Don't go yet. Yeah, what he's feeling at that point. Maybe a Roman soldier is just 25. He's slapping a 50-year-old man. It's humiliating. You're angry, right? There are two ways to respond. Either you hit back, and when you hit back and he has a sword, who knows what will happen? Either jail or worse, right? Or you walk away humiliated with your head shrugged. I asked you if you've ever been slapped. It's so humiliating, right? And disorienting, right? Yeah. But now Jesus says, wait a minute, do a radical thing. Turn your left cheek. Yeah. And as a soldier, first of all, I'll be, what? Okay? And I'll force you, because I'm a bully, psychopath, I don't want to be humiliated, to give you a proper slap. Thank you, Joey. Give him a round of applause, right? Here's the point in Jesus' teaching. When you're slapped and you're going through all that humiliation, when you're feeling so offended, so violated, so confused, you can either, and rage is boiling, you can either hit back in rage or walk away with embarrassment and retreat back. If you hit back, you're reduced to the same violent tactic as your oppressor. At that point, because you fought, you may think you're justified, but you've just responded with violence. But remember, Jesus is trying to teach a new way. He opens that passage by saying, you have had it always. An eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth. That is in the Bible, in the Old Testament, in the Mosaic laws, settled things. But Jesus is trying to teach something new. An eye for an eye, as Mahatma Gandhi said, then the whole world ends up blind, okay? So Jesus is trying to say, could there be something else? Could we break the cycle of violence, right? Without affirming the injustice and the oppression. On the other hand, if you lower your head, walk away humiliated, you affirm what the bully and the oppressor, is communicating. He feels he has won. He feels he can continue to do the injustice and run, and nobody will do with him anything. He continues to rub it in that you're inferior to them. And in a way also, yeah, because you gave into all that, it's like it continues unabated. In a way, we are complicit. You become complicit in that oppression. But Jesus proposes a third way, a more radical way. Turn the other cheek. Just turn it. Turn it. As you will see, this is not weak. It's not passive. It's courageous and strong and creative. And creative. First, the oppressor is completely shocked. This is not how things work, right? I give someone one backhand, yeah, and they become so humiliated and embarrassed, and they go, and I go celebrating. First, the oppressor is shocked. And you can already see the impact of that stand. They realize, yeah, I am not in charge here. Can you imagine? You disarm the oppressor. They're not in charge. And And they are forced to do what they do not approve. Obviously, chances are they will either give you a proper slap or let you go. Either way, you pass a message. So their oppression is called out. And in the meantime, you have done something else. You have shown yourself not to be violent or weak, but rather courageous. You have reclaimed your dignity in that moment, and you're strong. Yeah? It may come at the cost of an extra slap. Yeah? But you really communicated something. You have shown I'm looking for the word in English. Umeanika your oppressor, yeah, for the violence that he is. And you have transcended that moment of oppression without violence and without revenge. Similarly, Jesus gives two other examples. If someone takes you to court, right? There used to be rich landowners. This is actually addressing economic oppression. There used to be rich landowners who would lend to the poor, and eventually they would default. And once they would do that, they used to be really harsh. They were like Shylocks. They would take you to court, and because you have nothing to offer, they would ask for your coat. And those days, coats were rare. You only had one coat, and it was personal. It was precious. It was your one possession, right? And they would sue you for that, and they would take it. And you'd be left there once again. You haven't been hit, but you'd be embarrassed. You'd be stripped down. Yeah, you'd be stripped down. So Jesus says, in this context, once he sues you for your coat, strip down naked and give them your underwear as well. It's an equivalent of that. That's what they had that day. Your generosity leaves them defenseless and exposed. But in a sense, your exposure exposes the naked greed and cruelty of your oppressors. Again, just like in the case of the slap, you have transcended some oppression without violence. And you can be sure those people who are hearing that day, Jesus, either they laughed. Are you serious? Are you practical? Yeah? So that's a kind of context, If they're there, they are taking everything from you, and they've left you with the least, and you can just say, even this one, please go. Leave me with nothing. And you sow something in their hearts. They do not sleep peacefully. Yeah? And then that final example, if someone forces you to carry his pack for a mile, since time immemorial, military people have always carried heavy things. Now, the Romans would think, why should I carry when we have subjects? They grab one. Simon of Cyrene was a victim of that, but he ended up carrying a precious thing, the cross. Yeah? So they would force someone and load that for a mile. Remember, these military guys are fit and strong, but they load it on a poor peasant, and they were very systematic. They would just want you to carry a mile and find another innocent guy wandering around, give it to that one, right? But then Jesus says, if someone forces you to carry his pack for a mile, be willing to take that pack. When your mile ends, just say, I'm not done, by the way. Let's go another mile. You show yourself as generous. You reclaim your humanity. You're strong. You're self-controlled. You're dignified. The oppression is not the thing that controls you. It's not the thing that has the final say. The first mile you walked may have been forced. The second mile, you walk in freedom. And I would doubt, I doubt whether that soldier would be happy or laughing, right? They would be puzzled. And once again, you're disarming them, you're confusing them, you're exposing their brutality, their injustice, their oppression for what it is. And you're doing that, in this case, by demonstrating your own strength, your own dignity, and even showing something that they do not have, kindness. So that's what Jesus says. Yeah, that's what Jesus says as an example, not the only, one of the examples of responding to oppression. And maybe there hasn't been an opportune moment to listen to a message like this as the moment we are in, a moment of trying to respond to injustice and asking ourselves, what next? And I believe these are not easy invitations. Those were specific examples. maybe someone left that sermon and did exactly that, turned the other cheek. But then what does that look like for us? Rarely will you find someone slapping you, but oppression is in different ways. Oppression is in different ways. And one of the things that stood out is that Jesus is not only talking about the action, he's also talking about the heart beneath the person who's taking the action. You have to have a different heart, to stand up like that. The oppressed would need a radical change of heart. Can you imagine that? You are under oppression, but Jesus is saying, in as much as it's unfolding, you need a different kind of heart. A posture needed for acting and responding to the injustice and oppression in a different way. He does not undermine the difficulty, the humiliation, the anger. And I believe he's not necessarily putting people in harm's way. He's trying to give them some wisdom and some insight about how to respond. He's not saying, I doubt whether he would say, if you see that police with a gun, walk out to him. Maybe he's also saying, just have some wisdom. He doesn't want lives lost. He is rewriting history. He's rewriting history. History is full of old stories. An eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth. People are oppressed, and one day it boils out, and they face the oppressor, but it becomes an eye for an eye when it's violent. Much of history is about the oppressor winning and the oppressed losing and being humiliated. Or eventually, the oppressed fighting back and retaliating. That's the most common story. So when Jesus is rewriting history, he's saying there can be another story, another way to respond. He is empowering the oppressed to respond in creative, nonviolent, courageous, and humane ways. And I have said, maybe he's addressing our heart posture. And that's the space I would like to invite you. You've been watching all that has been happening. You've been at the forefront. You've been on the social media. You have been feeling things. You have been saying words. You have been acting for this moment. But even as we act, Jesus is asking us, what is our heart like? Because you will need a different kind of heart to continue engaging in this moment in the ways that Jesus would desire, and to carry it on for the long haul. Maybe a couple of examples, a couple of things that we need to check as far as our heart is concerned. And the first one is anger. Is anger. Think about that moment we were talking about a slap. You will feel angry, you will feel violated. And if you have the means, at that point, if you respond, you will just be full of adrenaline, and you'll maybe knock and punch that person down, something, or walk away, When your anger is raging and boiling and you act out of it, chances are it may not allow you to take the wisest action. So Jesus is not saying ignore the anger. He's giving you a chance, a moment to pause, to acknowledge, and to express, but to ensure that the anger does not lead. Acknowledge it, express it, but ensure the anger does not lead. I love a quote by Viktor Frankl. So Viktor Frankl was a Jew who had been arrested by the Nazi and spent most of the Second World War in a concentration camp. Before he was arrested, he was a practicing psychiatrist, and so he would see people and he would counsel them and he would make them well. And so even when he went to the concentration camp, he just decided he was going to pay attention to people. And for some reason, he escaped being killed or being burnt, as eventually they were being done. And he was freed by the Allied armies when the war ended. And so what he had spent his time doing was to look at people and how they faced their final moment. And ask himself, what made some people crumble, weeks and months before their final moment, and what made some people live a full life to the very moment they breathed their last. And so as a psychoanalyst, he decided, he undertook that in the concentration camp. So basically, they say that he left the concentration camp and wrote a book on his findings in about 4 weeks. Just, he had been thinking about it for so long that he just put it together, and within 4 weeks, he wrote the book, and it's one of the world's best-selling books. It's called Man's Search for Meaning. And one of the things he said is, between stimuli and response, there is a space. In that space, there is a choice. And in that choice, our whole lives are defined. Yeah? Between stimuli and response, there exists a space. And in that space, there exists choice. And in that choice, our whole life is defined. And maybe Jesus, by saying turn the other cheek, he's letting us become acutely aware. The stimuli is that you've been slapped. The response is that you may hit back. But he's making us just take that pause. And in that pause lies a choice of what you're going to do. And because of that choice, you'll forever be, it's going to cumulatively define your life. And so by saying turn the other cheek, he's saying, turn the other cheek, pause. I know you're angry. Yeah? I know you're angry. I know you've been offended. You've been violated. I know that, right? But there exists many possibilities of creative, strong, courageous responses that do not in any way undermine the injustice, but that would be wiser to walk in. So maybe one of the things we can take from this story in this moment is, how is your heart as far as anger is concerned? It is not to be ignored, and it is not to take the lead. It is to be expressed. It is to be healed. It is for you to say, beneath that anger there is something, and how may I respond? And I believe once we take that pause, our hearts are more open. If we don't, that anger may turn to something unhelpful even for us. We might carry it for longer than we need to. We need to heal it, and we need to offer it to Jesus. And in that pause, we reclaim our courage, our strength, our dignity, and creatively face up to the injustice. I struggle to come up with examples of what turning the other cheek might look like. But maybe it's something we can lean into. Yeah. Secondly, these responses by Jesus, they allow you to see other things. First, you're grounded in your own. You're grateful. You're grateful to be alive. That oppression did not kill you. And it shifts your perspective. You are not fighting doom. Eventually, it shifts your perspective, and you are preserving something good. Sometimes when you're angry, you fail to see the good. You only see the wrong. And so it helps your work. It gives you energy. You are fueled more by love than by the fear of the bad. You are able to see the good, and you're able to pause and be grateful for the good that already exists. Maybe that's what that pause is. There is good. In many activist circles, they talk about the word resistance. And I found it very interesting when this American activist decided, why are we calling our activism resistance? It's almost like saying our activism comes in response to the bad. And this activist was trying to say the good was what was there originally. And actually the greed, the corruption, the oppression is resisting the life. And so your work is to insist on the good. And that's what they were trying to say. It's almost like an insistence. And so maybe in the pause, maybe in creative responses, maybe in taking the extra mile, maybe in seeking the creative ways, you are insisting on the good, and you're able to be fueled by love. And finally, I would say, our hearts need to be anchored on God. Yeah, our hearts need to be anchored on God. It's easy to be carried by waves and waves. One theologian, when trying to define what being possessed is, gave an example of mob justice. Yeah, if someone has ever been caught in mob justice, they say they feel like they have been carried in a wave. Yeah, and they didn't know, they just acted, people are going. And when you watch those videos of people, for instance, stepping into a business and looting, you see, how is it that they can all be just moving like a wave? So I give that example to say at any given point, one of my reflections has been the enemy, like a roaring lion, is not at rest. It is not just a physical reality, it is also a spiritual reality. We need to be grounded more and more in God. We need to say, in this anger, in this chaotic moment, God, how are you acting? How will you move me? Yeah? And even in this movement, if you look keenly, you can just see multiple forces at work. It started out as good and beautiful. Maybe it's this creative response that Jesus was talking about, but then you can just see how hijacked it has been. And so, moving forward, at least to be grounded on God, to say, let your spirit guide me in this response. I don't know, I may not give you many examples, but one example that I love is of Martin Luther King. You know, one day Martin Luther King was talking to the people he was working with as they protested racism. And he told them, guess what, people? Our end goal is not only to win and defeat the oppressor, but to convert the oppressor to become our friend. Right? He said, our goal is not just to go and storm the bridge of Selma and win the oppressor and show them that we did it. Our goal is to win over the oppressor to become a friend. And when you think about what goes into that, you need a different kind of heart. You know, you need to walk up to your oppressor and deal with him right now. He will clobber you, but no, your end goal is to win him over to become a friend, not to live there. And so you need a heart grounded in God. That's one good example. It's non-violent, it's creative, it takes time. You go to God again and again, you can only do it by God's strength. The second example is King David. You know, God gave up on King Saul and actually picked a successor. But then, it was 13 years between when David was anointed as king and when he finally took the throne. 13 years. What was going on in those 13 years? David survived several assassination attempts by Saul. You know, he tried to work with him, to support him. The assassination attempts became so vicious, he went to the bush, created his own army. And there's this one moment that stands out. Saul has a bigger and better and more equipped army. David has a band of guys he roams around with. And Saul is hunting David, and he's closing in. And so David has to hide with his men in a cave, until Saul passes. And guess what happens? It so happens that Saul has to attend a call of nature. He goes to the exact same cave where David is hiding. And so David and his men maybe pull back into the dark. Saul goes there and robes himself, puts his kingly robe on the side and does his business and goes out. And the men in the dark are whispering to David, this is your chance. This is your chance. Why leave hiding? But what does David do? He takes his sword, goes and takes the robe and cuts a piece of Saul's robe and leaves him. And he says one of the most often quoted lines in the Old Testament that says, do not touch the Lord's, who am I to touch the Lord's anointed, or something in that translation, right? And so, what kind of heart does that? You know, you even have been sworn in as the next president, right? And you have a chance, and you're there just being oppressed, but he decides not to do it in a non-violent way and to trust God's action on things. Ultimately, Saul died in battle, and the news came to David, and he knew it was his time, but it wasn't through his hand. I think that's another example. And finally, the example of Jesus. I believe if you can dare preach this and tell people this teaching, you must practice it yourself. You must practice it yourself. Eventually, this Jesus who talked about this died through Roman military, in the hands of the Roman military. He went through an unfair trial. He was accused and condemned unfairly. There was no one to defend him. He carried his cross through an entire street. He was mocked. He was stripped naked, and eventually he died. And you know, I was thinking about that. And sometimes Maybe what Jesus didn't tell people on the Sermon on the Mount is, if you choose this nonviolent approach, you will pay the highest price. And the highest price is always one's life. And maybe for him, it was that. He paid the highest price. But I think his death and resurrection says, even if we pay the ultimate price, injustice never has the last word. Resurrection always happens. So the Romans killed Jesus, but did they silence Jesus? Maybe that's a question. Today, the Roman Empire is almost forgotten. But here we are, gathered because of the message of Jesus, because of the ways of Jesus. And maybe, I was just thinking about this sermon and thought I would say a disclaimer. Today I'll say what you don't want to hear, right? Maybe you're looking at it and you're like, it's so impractical, it's so useless. And maybe Jesus just wants us to have faith in him, to have trust in him, to know that he said these words, he walked them 100%, and we can trust him in our moment. You can lean in and ask yourself, what does turning the other cheek look like? What does going another mile look like? Yeah, what are the creative? We can educate ourselves, we can grow, and I believe his spirit and his insight will guide us into all that. Guard your heart more than anything else, because the source of your life flows from it. Guard your heart above all else, because the source of life flows from it. Beginning with the little spaces where you find yourself and other spaces. Guard your heart. And may God help us. Let's pray. Father, in this season of great unrest within us, of agitating for justice, for fairness, for governance, we have been experiencing this moment in various ways as individuals here and collectively as a nation. But one thing we have in common is that we are crying out for justice, we are crying out for the right things. And today, gathered in your presence, we want to offer our hearts to you. We do not want to go into a future where we are bitter, where we continue perpetuating the cycles of oppression. But we want to go into the future with open hearts, hearts that are defined by courage and creativity and commitment and good and wise labor for that which is right. And we are calling on you at this moment. Show us how. Give us strength. Guide us. We offer our anger to you. We do not want to dismiss it, but we want it to be healed and changed and transformed into love, into acts of love in moments like this. Open up the possibilities that lie for us. And we continue, oh God, to commit the matters of this nation to you. We pray that there will be change, lasting change, good change, that this nation can increasingly live up to its ideals, some of which are captured in the beautiful words of our national anthem, that plenty may be found within our borders for everyone, that we may stand firm to defend all that is good, that every heart in this country will be filled with thanksgiving. So continue to guide us and to lead us, and may we be some of those people who bring about that change. This we pray, trusting and believing in your holy name. Amen.